name is Bruno Moreland, and I teach AP African American Studies, and in this series, I'm going to go over all the required sources in the AP African American Studies curriculum. Today, we're looking at topic 2.4, African Resistance on Slave Ships and the Anti-Slavery Movement. This unit topic actually has quite a few required sources, starting with the diagram of the slave ship Brookes. This diagram was printed as a broadside, and it was put on walls and distributed amongst people by the anti-slavery movement. It was printed as a response to the passage of the Act to regulate the slave trade in Britain in 1788. This might have been a reaction to the 1781 Zong or Zorg massacre. The Zorg was a British slave ship that had been completely mismanaged and navigated off course, and before it reached its destination in the West Indies, at least 130 of their human cargo were thrown overboard before arriving to their final destination, partially as a way to recoup some of the losses through insurance payments. The purpose of the act was partially to ease the overcrowdedness that was happening on slave ships. It set a formula for a limit of number of people that a ship could transport at 1.67 people per ton of ship, up to 207 tons. After the 207 tons, it would be one person per ton. The slave ship Brookes, as it's noted in the caption, could hold 454 people and still comply with the new regulation. Additionally, it gives information about how the slave ship Brookes actually made a passage across the Atlantic with 609 people aboard, which is crazy when you look at how packed together the 454 people that it actually shows. So as you look through the various parts of the diagram, you can see that every inch of space in the hull of the ship is being used for people to lay down. That was required by this new act to regulate the slave trade, that every man had to have a certain length and width available to him. Women would have a slightly smaller height, and then children even smaller. Below the ship, there was 2 levels that were constructed in order to house all these people, but even then it was difficult for them to be able to move around, as most of them would be shackled up depending on the division that they were in. That's the other thing you should look at. The men, women, and children were kept in different areas. All of the men would have been shackled or tied together. Women and children would have had a little bit more freedom to roam around, but their sections would have been kept apart from each other. The enslaved people would have been brought on top of the deck for at least once a day in order to exercise and also to get their food. But when they were on the deck of the ship, they would be closely monitored to avoid any sort of insurrections from happening. The tight spaces, the shackling together, and the supervision, and even large structures on the deck of the ship, like the barricados that were meant to keep the enslaved people away from the rest of the sailors, would have made insurrections on slave ships extremely difficult, though they did still happen. This diagram, as it was printed by the anti-slavery societies, is meant to shock the viewer. Viewers may have known the conditions aboard a slave ship might have been overcrowded or pretty terrible, but this was meant to show them exactly the types of conditions that enslaved people would have been subjected to. That means that the anti-slavery advocates didn't stop at just passing this act to regulate the slave trade. In fact, many British abolitionists in Parliament actually opposed the act. Firstly, because it was seen as a blessing that the British government was giving for the slave trade to continue, even if it was doing so under more restrictions. Secondly, morally, they believed that by fixing the overcrowded issue on board slave ships, it did not absolve people from practicing what they saw as a sinful or evil institution. After the passage of this act and the general opinion in Britain swaying more towards abolition, in 1807, Parliament abolished the international slave trade, but it did not free those people that were already in bondage. Those people had to wait until 1833 when slavery was formally abolished across the British Empire. And even then, it was done in a gradual manner, so much so that people up until 1838 were still enslaved. The next document comes from the Amistad case. The Amistad was a Spanish ship that illegally kidnapped people from Sierra Leone and tried to transport them to Havana, Cuba. And this was strictly illegal because Spain, as well as Britain by this point, had abolished the international slave trade. Led by a 25-year-old man named Sengbe Pie, or Joseph Cinque as he's known in the United States, revolted against the crew, killed the captain, and then kept 2 sailors alive so that they could help them navigate back to Africa. The sailors, whose lives were spared, secretly started to navigate northward in the middle of the night, and eventually they made dock in New York. At that point, the U.S. Navy boarded the ship and arrested the people who had been illegally enslaved and then put them in jail, awaiting trial for piracy and murder. Now, there's a couple more things that we need to establish before we go on. The United States had already ended its international slave trade in 1807, even though slavery and the internal slave trade were still legal in the United States. Secondly, New York, where the ship landed, had already abolished slavery as well. So the document that we see is actually a plea to the court saying to the judge that the people who are imprisoned and awaiting trial are free people and that the United States does not have jurisdiction to try them for any sort of crime. It lays it out in a few different paragraphs, and it first establishes the context that they were all illegally enslaved while in Sierra Leone. Here's what they say. That they are severally natives of Africa and were born free, and ever since have been, and still of right, are and ought to be free and not slaves, as is said in several libels pretended or surmised. That they were domiciled in the island of Cuba, or the dominion of the Queen of Spain, or subject of the laws thereof, that on or about the 15th day of April, 1839, they and each of them were, in the land of their nativity, unlawfully kidnapped and forcibly and wrongfully carried on board of a certain vessel near the coast of Africa, then and there unlawfully engaged in the slave trade by certain persons to them unknown, and were thence in said vessel, contrary to the will of these respondents, unlawfully transported to the island of Cuba for the unlawful purpose of being sold there as slaves, and then were illegally landed for the purpose aforesaid. As they established that they had the rights to be free, then it frames their insurrection as something that they had the rights to do. That the respondents, being treated on board said vessel by said Rees and Montes and the captain and crew thereof with great cruelty and oppression, and being of right free as aforesaid, were incited by the love of liberty natural to all men, and by the desire of returning to their families and kindred to take possessions of said vessel, while navigating the high seas as aforesaid near the islands of Cuba, as they had rights to do, with the intent to return therein to their native country, or to seek asylum in some free states where slavery did not exist, in order that they might enjoy their liberty under the protection of its government. And finally, this letter to the court claims that the court has no rights to hear their case or to continue to hold them in jail for these crimes. Wherefore the respondents severally say that neither by the Constitution or laws of the United States or any treaty pursuant thereto, nor by the law of nations doth it pertain to his honorable courts to exercise any jurisdiction over the persons of these respondents or any of them by reason of any of the proceedings aforesaid, and they severally pray to be hence disrupted and suffered to be and remain as they of right ought to be free and at liberty from this process of this honorable court aforesaid, under which or under color of which they are holders as aforesaid. The court case will continue to go through its rank until it's finally heard in 1841. And very famously, former President John Quincy Adams ends up as a co-counsel or lawyer for these defendants. The Supreme Court ultimately sides on the side of these defendants and lets them go, and by 1842, those that had survived ended up going back to Sierra Leone. The next set of documents is actually a collection of sketches of those people that were on board of the Amistad. It was a very big news story at the time, and the people in Connecticut were certainly interested to come and see them. Therefore, the jailer would charge what was called a New York shilling, or 12.5 cents, for people to come and look at them while they were outside doing exercises. As the trial was also public, people were able to come in and see the defendants. And that's where we get these sketches. The 18-year-old artist William Townsend showed up to many of the days of the court and sketched the people as they were sitting waiting their trial. What's interesting about these sketches is that he's portraying them in a very realistic way and does not try to caricaturize them in any way to make them seem like they are not worthy of their freedom. And the last required source for this topic is an art piece titled Stowage by artist Willie from 1997. This piece of art is meant to look like a slave ship diagram, very similar to the one that we just looked at with the slave ship Brookes, but in fact, it's made out of ordinary household objects. What looks like a slave ship is actually an ironing board, and then the shapes that surround it are actually irons. Cole said that he was inspired to use these items as part of his art because his grandma and his mom growing up were housekeepers. This was a trade that was very common for Black women in the mid-20th century. What's unique about this piece of art is it reimagines a symbol of the African diaspora and a symbol of slavery with another symbol of economic disadvantage that was caused by Jim Crow laws in the 20th century. He also uses the same symbolism and shapes of the irons in a lot of his other prints, and he's carrying out a reclamation of the symbol as he's creating new and more beautiful art with it. So, we're looking at this piece of art and we see that the ironing board is meant to be the slave ship and each little dot is meant to be an enslaved person being carried aboard. But the irons that surround it are supposed to be African masks, and they're supposed to symbolize all the differing identities of the people who were aboard these ships. This takes away some of the anonymity that we see in the slave ship Brookes. He gives the people that were aboard these ships that are very commonly just seen as another number a form of identity. So that's all the sources for this topic. If there's one that you particularly enjoyed or were interested in, please let me know. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.